Let's talk wide receiver tiers next on Fantasy Football Today in 5. Welcome to FFT in 5. I'm Chris Towers. I'm here with Dan Schneier. We're talking wide receiver tiers. For more, go through all the wide receivers pretty much. Make sure you listen to the full episode of Fantasy Football Today, and make sure you go to tinyurl.com/FFT donate. We've got a lot of great stuff over there for our FFT draftathon, which is coming up in August. There's going to be a lot of opportunities there to talk with me, Dan, the rest of the FFT team. Got a lot of really cool opportunities, some unique content as well. So make sure you go to tinyurl.com/FFT donate for the Fantasy Football Today draftathon. And Dan, my first question when talking about the wide receiver tiers, is the first tier at wide receiver a 1-player tier, a 2-player tier, a 3-player tier, or a 4-player tier? How do you rank it?
So today on the regular show, we discussed Jamie's tier, which is 4 players. Mine is only 2 players. Mine is Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson.
Okay, so you've got Chase at the top, or is it Jefferson at the top?
I have Jefferson at the top, then Chase.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Jefferson is the number 1 player. I think you can either make the case, for me at least, it's either a 1-player tier with Jefferson as a clear number 1, or I would go 4. I do have Cooper Kupp. Actually, I have 3. Sorry, excuse me. I have Cooper Kupp in that tier with Jamar Chase. And then I've got Tyreek Hill and Stephon Diggs as kind of a mini tier of 2 after that. So for me, it's Kupp, Jefferson, Kupp, and Chase. I think you can make a case for any of them really as the number 1 wide receiver. I think any of them are worth as early as a top 5 pick, but you've got Kupp in the second tier. What separates him from the other 2?
Well, most importantly for me, it's quarterback play. I
Sure.
find that the Rams situation a bit uncertain. Matthew Stafford missed most of last season with an injury. He's much older age. Those back issues are reoccurring. So the biggest issue for me is that Rams offense and as a whole.
Yeah, that offense as a whole doesn't look great. It should be fairly concentrated. You know, Cooper Kupp was still arguably among the league leaders in target share last season. I think it was at 31% before his injury, and was putting up 25 points per game for the second straight year, something that no other wide receiver has done, certainly among active players. I think Jerry Rice might have done it. But yeah, it's pretty spectacular what he's done. And then the next tier for me, like I said, Tyreek Hill and Stephon Diggs. Is Kupp in that tier with you?
Kupp is in that tier. It's actually just a 2-player tier or 3-player tier, 3-player tier. It's Kupp, Diggs, and Tyreek Hill.
Okay, and then the next tier for me is Devontae Adams, CeeDee Lamb, A.J. Brown, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Do you have anybody else in that tier, or is that tier different?
That tier is the same for me, except I do not have Adams in that tier.
Okay, what's the difference on Adams?
For me with Adams, I think a lot of it was I still think he's the best, if not one of the best players of the position in the NFL, but I unfortunately can't let that impact my entire fantasy outlook. I look at his stats last year and I look at his production from a fantasy standpoint, and I think a lot of it had to do with Derek Carr in absolute effort mode. Derek Carr was throwing downfield for the first time in his career, and that led to a lot of production from Devontae Adams. I cannot get over the film I've seen of Jimmy Garoppolo. I think he's a terrible quarterback, one of the worst starting in the NFL, if not the worst, and I don't think he's going to throw the ball downfield. There'll be a lot of targets for Adams, but they're going to be bad targets, and I think I can get that from a few other players. DJ Moore, you can get a lot later. Players like that who are still going to have targets funneled through them, but bad quarterback play, but you can get them later.
Yeah, Jimmy Garoppolo, only 15.3% of his passes last season traveled at least 15 yards past the line of scrimmage. That was the fourth lowest mark among qualifiers at quarterback. Derek Carr had the 7th highest number. The only thing I would point out is Adams had 59 targets, 15-plus yards down the field. That was the most in the NFL. His 42.4% catch rate was the lowest of any player in the top 5. So, like you said, Derek Carr was willing to throw the ball down the field a lot, but it wasn't like they were super successful on those. So I do kind of look at it and say,
from a catch rate standpoint, but didn't he have a lot of production on the deep passes?
Well, yeah, because there were so many of them, and I can see an argument for Jimmy Garoppolo not throwing those passes as often. But I kind of look at it this way: if you've got Devontae Adams, you're just going to throw 30% of your passes to him, right? Like that. I just think that's the way it's going to work. And
I think the volume will be there. It's
the volume is going to overwhelm everything.
Yeah, sorry. It's just a matter of how good that volume will be. And can you get guys like DJ Moore who might have 30% too much later?
Yeah. I think things open up a lot after that group.
Yes.
I've got Garrett Wilson, T. Higgins, Devontae Smith, and Jalen Waddle in my next tier. I would assume you have Devontae Adams in that next tier. Yep. Who else is in that tier with him?
It's literally just the guys you named.
Yeah. Okay. And then I think things really start to open up after that, because I think you can go to Waddle, and I think that's 13 players deep. And I feel pretty good about having any of those guys as my number one. And if any of them are my number two, I feel great about a wide receiver heavy approach. After that, I've got Keenan Allen, DK Metcalf, Calvin Ridley, and Chris Olave in my next tier. And then it's Deebo Samuel, Amari Cooper, DeAndre Hopkins, Chris Godwin, Terry McLaurin, Tyler Lockett, and Christian Watson. I'm sure there's a lot of differences there. And I think that's the key is that, I think you can make a case for Christian Watson being in the tier above. If you're really high on the upside there, I think a lot of people are going to have DJ Moore in one of those two tiers. I think people will have Jerry Jeudy in those two tiers. I've thought about having Marquise Brown in those two tiers with how good he was, a top 8 wide receiver when DeAndre Hopkins was out last season. So I think the thing about wide receivers, and you and I were talking about this when we were doing a mock draft yesterday, which you can find on CBSSports.com, but it's just, if you don't get one of the good wide receivers, one of that top 13, as I didn't yesterday, I went 2 running backs with my first 2 picks, you're going to feel pretty iffy about your wide receiver options. So it's not that there's not upside, but once you get to like the 4th or 5th tier, starting with like RB 15 or so, maybe 18, Deebo Samuel, Amari Cooper, that kind of range, if those guys are your number one, you're going to feel pretty bad about it. And that was the situation I ended up with in yesterday's draft, and I did not love it. So moving forward, I'm going to make sure I get one of those higher end wide receivers. Is there anything else you want to add about those, first 20 or so wide receivers?
No, I think you nailed it down, Chris.
All right, that's going to do it for FFT and 5. We'll be back tomorrow to talk tight end tiers. We'll see you then.